All right, so you wanted to dive deep into Second Corinthians, and let me tell you, this letter is packed with emotion, reassurance, and some seriously powerful insights. We're working with the World English Bible Catholic Book Order translation, which gives us some interesting nuances to explore. Get ready for some haha moments, because Paul doesn't hold back.
That's for sure. This letter is quite a journey. Paul, joined by Timothy, is writing to the assembly of God in Corinth and all the saints in Achaia. And right from the start, it feels incredibly personal. Yeah.
Okay, so starting with chapter 1, we see Paul pouring out his heart, but it's not just venting. It's about connecting on a deeply human level, right? He even talks about this intense near-death experience he had in Asia.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how Paul uses this personal hardship to connect with the Corinthians. He's not preaching from some untouchable position. He's right there with them, reminding them that they aren't alone in their struggles.
Right, it seems like he's been through a lot, but then there's this amazing shift in chapter 2 where he talks about the relief and joy he felt upon hearing that the Corinthians had responded well to his previous letter.
Exactly. He even says, and I love this quote, "Great is my boldness of speech toward you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I am filled with comfort. I overflow with joy in all our afflictions." I mean, this contrast between hardship and overflowing joy speaks volumes about the power of faith and forgiveness to help us overcome challenges.
I love that quote. Now, chapter 3 has this incredible metaphor that really struck me. Paul describes the Corinthians as a living letter, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tablets of stone, but in tablets that are hearts of flesh.
Whoa, that's a powerful image, isn't it? Really highlights the transformative power of the Christian faith. It's not about external rules or empty rituals, but about a genuine change of heart that's reflected in how we live our lives.
Absolutely, and he keeps building on this idea in chapters 4 and 5. He dives into the core of his ministry, calling himself and his companions ambassadors on behalf of Christ, tasked with reconciling people to God.
This is huge. It shows how Christians are called to be agents of peace and reconciliation in the world, bridging divides and mending broken relationships. It's about embodying that transformative change he was talking about earlier.
Right, right. So shifting gears a bit, in chapters 6 and 7, Paul focuses on integrity and defending his ministry. There seems to be some tension brewing with folks questioning his authority.
It's interesting how he handled it, though. Instead of getting defensive or trying to prove his worthiness, he appeals to his own integrity and the sincerity of his motives.
Yeah, and then chapters 8 and 9 bring in this whole discussion about generosity and the collection for the saints in Jerusalem.
He praises the Macedonian churches for their incredible generosity despite facing poverty themselves. He even uses the phrase, and it's so good, "Deep poverty abounded to the riches of their generosity."
What I find interesting is that he's not demanding a specific amount, right? He's emphasizing the heart behind the gift, encouraging cheerful giving according to what you have, not what you lack.
Absolutely. It ties back to that idea of inward transformation we were talking about. True generosity flows from a changed heart, not from external pressure or obligation.
Okay, now chapter 10 gets a little spicy. Paul seems to be addressing some pushback he's been getting, with people questioning his authority and calling him weak in person.
He doesn't shy away from the confrontation, that's for sure. He defends his ministry, but what's intriguing is how he highlights the spiritual weapons he uses to fight against falsehood. It's not about worldly power struggles, but a battle for the truth of the gospel.
Then in chapter 11, it's like he lays all his cards on the table. He goes into this almost comical list of all the hardships he's endured, beatings, imprisonments, shipwrecks, you name it.
It's almost like he's saying, "You think I'm weak. Let me tell you what I've been through." But it's more than just boasting. It's a testament to his unwavering commitment and the depth of his love for the Corinthians and for Christ.
Definitely not holding back. Then we get to chapter 12 and this whole discussion about the thorn in the flesh, something Paul struggled with deeply.
Yeah, he even begged God 3 times to remove it, but instead God says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." This is such a powerful message about finding strength and purpose in our challenges.
It's like he's saying our weaknesses don't disqualify us, right? In fact, God's power shines brightest through our vulnerability.
It's a radical idea, isn't it? It challenges us to reevaluate our own notions of strength and to lean into God's grace in those moments when we feel most inadequate.
As we move into chapter 13, Paul wraps things up with a call to self-examination. He urges the Corinthians to examine your own selves, whether you are in the faith. Test your own selves. It's about making sure our lives are aligned with our beliefs.
It's a powerful reminder that faith isn't passive. It requires active reflection, self-assessment, and a willingness to make adjustments where needed. It's a call to live authentically and intentionally.
Okay, so we've touched on all 13 chapters, experiencing Paul's emotional highs and lows, his powerful metaphors, and his unwavering commitment to the gospel. And what I find really fascinating is how he weaves it all together.
It's true. There's this beautiful thread running through the entire letter, connecting the personal with the theological, and ultimately pointing towards a life transformed by the power of the gospel.
Now, I don't want to give everything away just yet, but this theme of transformation seems to be a cool takeaway from Second Corinthians. It's not just about knowing the right things. It's about letting that knowledge shape us from the inside out.
You're right. It's about allowing God's grace to work in us, to soften our hearts, to shape our actions, and to ultimately make us more like Christ.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, but there's still so much to unpack. We'll be back in just a moment to delve even deeper into some of these fascinating themes.
Welcome back. It's amazing how much ground we covered already in Second Corinthians.
I know, right? And we've only just scratched the surface, but before we dive back in, there's something that's been on my mind. You know how Paul keeps emphasizing this idea of inward transformation?
Yes, it's a recurring theme throughout the letter.
Well, it makes me wonder, what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, how do we go from knowing about God's grace to actually experiencing its transformative power in our lives?
That's a great question, and I think Second Corinthians offers some really practical insights. Remember back in chapters 4 and 5 where Paul talks about being ambassadors for Christ?
Yeah, tasked with reconciling people to God.
Right, that's not just some lofty theological concept. It has real-world implications for how we interact with others, how we respond to conflict, and even how we view ourselves.
So it's about putting our faith into action.
Exactly. It's about letting our transformed hearts guide our words and actions. And that can be challenging, especially when we're faced with opposition or difficult circumstances.
Speaking of challenges, you know what really struck me? Paul's vulnerability in chapter 12 when he talks about his thorn in the flesh. He begged God to remove it, but instead God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness."
That passage is so powerful. It reminds us that our weaknesses don't disqualify us from experiencing God's grace. In fact, it's often in our brokenness that we discover God's strength most profoundly.
It's almost like a paradox, isn't it? The more we acknowledge our limitations, the more we open ourselves up to God's transforming power.
Exactly. And I think that's a key part of what it means to be a living letter, as Paul described it. It's about allowing God's grace to work in us, to shape us, and to make us into vessels that reflect his love and power.
That makes me think about the passage in chapter 3, where Paul contrasts the letter written on stone tablets with the letter written on hearts of flesh.
Yes, he's saying that true transformation isn't about following external rules, but about a deep inward change that flows from the Holy Spirit.
Okay, but how does this connect back to Paul's role as an ambassador?
Well, if our hearts are truly transformed by God's grace, it will be evident in how we represent Christ to the world. Our words will be seasoned with grace, our actions will be motivated by love, and our lives will be a testament to the transformative power of the gospel.
So it's not just about what we say, but about how we live.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to your earlier question about what inward transformation looks like in practice. It's about living out our faith in tangible ways in our relationships, in our work, and in our interactions with the world around us.
Now, thinking about Paul's interactions, there's one thing that always strikes me about Second Corinthians. It's a very personal letter, filled with emotion and even some tough love, but underneath it all, you can sense Paul's deep affection for the Corinthians.
It's true. He's not afraid to confront them when they're in the wrong, but he does so with a heart of compassion and a genuine desire for reconciliation.
And it's not just about correcting their behavior, right? He wants them to experience the fullness of God's grace and to grow in their faith. It's like a parent disciplining a child out of love.
That's a great analogy, and it speaks to the pastoral heart of Paul. He's not just a theologian or a preacher, he's a shepherd caring for his flock.
Okay, so we've talked about inward transformation, living as ambassadors, and Paul's pastoral approach. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to explore. It's something that's been a source of debate and discussion for centuries.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What are you thinking of?
Well, it's the whole question of Paul's authority. Throughout 2 Corinthians, he faces opposition from people who question his legitimacy as an apostle.
Ah, yes, that's a fascinating aspect of the letter, and it ties back to our earlier discussion about strength and weakness.
You mean how Paul embraces his limitations and finds strength in his dependence on God?
Exactly. Instead of boasting about his accomplishments or trying to prove his worthiness, he emphasizes his weaknesses. He talks about his thorn in the flesh, his struggles, and even his failures.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why would he highlight his weaknesses when he's trying to establish his authority?
Because Paul understood that true authority doesn't come from worldly power or self-promotion. It comes from humility and a deep reliance on God. He believed that God's power is made perfect in our weakness.
So he's flipping the script on what it means to be a leader.
Precisely. And I think that's a powerful message for us today, especially a culture that often equates leadership with charisma, dominance, and having it all together.
It makes me wonder, are we sometimes too focused on projecting an image of strength and perfection? Do we miss out on the transformative power of God's grace because we're afraid to acknowledge our weaknesses?
Those are profound questions, and I think they're at the heart of what Paul is trying to convey in 2 Corinthians. It's about embracing our humanity, acknowledging our need for God, and allowing His grace to shape us into the people He created us to be.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all ties together. Paul's vulnerability, his emphasis on inward transformation, his pastoral approach, and his unique view of authority are all interconnected.
Yes, and it's through these interconnected themes that we can begin to grasp the depth and richness of 2 Corinthians. It's a letter that challenges us, encourages us, and ultimately points us towards a life transformed by the power of the gospel.
We've been diving deep for a while now, and I'm sensing we're approaching the final bend of this deep dive. Let's take a quick pause and come back to wrap things up with a few key takeaways from 2 Corinthians.
All right, we're back. Going through 7 Corinthians like this, I'm struck by how relevant Paul's message still is today.
Oh, absolutely. It's a letter that speaks across centuries, offering timeless wisdom for navigating the complexities of life, relationships, and faith.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful takeaways is that idea of finding strength in weakness. It's so countercultural, especially in a world that often celebrates power and self-sufficiency, for sure. It's a reminder that God's grace isn't something we earn or achieve. It's a gift, freely given, and it's often in our moments of vulnerability that we experience it most profoundly.
Yeah, it makes me think about all the times I've tried to hide my struggles or pretend I have it all together. Maybe embracing our weaknesses is actually the key to unlocking true strength and resilience.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? It requires letting go of our need for control and surrendering to God's work in our lives.
And speaking of surrender, another theme that really resonated with me is this idea of being ambassadors for Christ. It's a call to action, to live out our faith in tangible ways.
Right. It's about being representatives of God's love and grace in the world, not just in our words, but in our actions.
But what does that look like practically? I mean, we're not all called to be missionaries or preachers.
True, but we all have spheres of influence, our families, our workplaces, our communities. It's about being intentional about reflecting God's character in those spaces.
So it could be as simple as offering a kind word to a stranger, extending forgiveness to someone who's hurt us, or standing up for what's right even when it's difficult.
Exactly. It's about letting our transformed hearts guide our interactions and our decisions. And, one of the most powerful ways we can be ambassadors is by extending grace to others, just as God has extended grace to us.
Yeah, that makes me think about the whole discussion in chapters 8 and 9 about generosity and the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. It wasn't about giving out of obligation, but out of a cheerful heart.
Right. It's about recognizing that everything we have is a gift from God and being willing to share those gifts freely with others.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to circle back to something you said earlier, that 2 Corinthians offers timeless wisdom for navigating the complexities of life.
Yes, and I think one of the most valuable pieces of wisdom is that call to self-examination in chapter 13. Paul urges the Corinthians and us to examine yourselves. Whether you are in the faith, test yourselves.
Yeah, it's easy to go through life on autopilot, but Paul is challenging us to be intentional, to reflect on our beliefs, and to make sure our lives are aligned with our faith.
It's about living authentically and with integrity, constantly seeking to grow and mature in our relationship with God.
So as we close out this deep dive into 2 Corinthians, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
I think it's this: even in the midst of hardship, conflict, and personal weakness, God's grace is sufficient. Paul's letter is a testament to that truth. He faced incredible challenges, yet he never gave up hope. He found strength in his weakness, and he continued to proclaim the gospel with boldness and compassion.
It's a powerful reminder that we don't have to be perfect to experience God's grace and to be used by Him. In fact, it's often in our brokenness that we discover our true strength and purpose. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of knowledge.